Jeremiah Cole, a respected black federal judge, faces racial prejudice and systemic corruption when he's unjustly targeted by Officer Daniels, who accuses him of loitering simply because of his race. Despite holding a prestigious position, Jeremiah is treated with suspicion, and Daniels uses his badge to belittle and intimidate him. As the situation escalates, Jeremiah fights back with unwavering resolve, exposing the deep-seated racism and abuse of power within the police department. His battle not only challenges Daniels, but also highlights the pervasive inequalities that continue to affect marginalized communities. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Garrison Cafe, casting golden light on the polished oak floors. The smell of fresh brewed coffee mingled with the sweet aroma of baked pastries, wrapping the room in warmth. It was a bustling weekday morning, the kind that saw hurried professionals grabbing their lattes to go while retirees lingered over newspapers and scones. In a corner booth, a man sat quietly, his presence commanding yet understated. Jeremiah Cole, federal judge and one of the most respected legal minds in the country, sipped his coffee while reading the newspaper. At 52, his chiseled features and salt-and-pepper hair gave him a dignified air, but his unassuming demeanor often belied his influence. Today, he was dressed in a crisp, plain white shirt with rolled-up sleeves, dark jeans, and well-worn loafers. To the casual observer, he could have been any other patron. Jeremiah loved this cafe. Tucked away from the grandeur of the city's towering skyscrapers, it reminded him of simpler times. He'd grown up in a small southern town where his mother worked tirelessly as a seamstress and his father as a mechanic. Despite his meteoric rise through the legal ranks, Jeremiah never forgot his roots. He often returned to spaces like this, far removed from the courtrooms where lawyers whispered his name in hushed reverence. He glanced at his watch. He had a meeting across town with a group of civic leaders, a discussion about criminal justice reform in the city, a cause close to his heart. Though he had presided over some of the nation's most high-profile cases, Jeremiah considered his advocacy for systemic change his most important work. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his thoughts. "Judge Cole?" Jeremiah looked up to see a young man, probably in his late 20s, holding a steaming cappuccino in one hand and a laptop bag in the other. "Yes," Jeremiah said, folding his newspaper. "I'm Marcus, one of the interns at the Justice Initiative. I've been following your work. It's an honor to meet you," Marcus said, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. Jeremiah smiled warmly and gestured to the seat across from him. "Have a seat, Marcus. I appreciate your dedication to the cause. How's the internship treating you?" The young man sat down, his awe evident. "It's been incredible. I've learned so much about restorative justice and the importance of community engagement. But it's also—" Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Eye-opening. The barriers to reform are more deeply rooted than I ever imagined." Jeremiah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The fight for justice isn't easy, Marcus. The system wasn't designed to be fair to everyone, but that's why we do what we do, to challenge it, to bend it toward equality." Before Marcus could respond, the cafe door swung open, and a small group entered, bringing with them the crisp autumn air. They were loud and impeccably dressed, their expensive suits and designer handbags announcing their arrival. Jeremiah recognized the type immediately: corporate executives, likely meeting for a networking breakfast. The group approached the counter, their laughter cutting through the cafe's hum. Jeremiah returned his attention to Marcus, but he couldn't help noticing the way one of the women in the group, a sharp-eyed brunette with a perfectly tailored blazer, glanced in his direction. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment before flicking away with a subtle arch of her brow. Marcus must have noticed too. "It's funny how people can judge someone by their appearance," he said, lowering his voice. Jeremiah chuckled softly. "I've been underestimated my whole life, Marcus. You learn to let it roll off your back." The conversation shifted to the upcoming meeting, but Jeremiah remained aware of the woman's gaze. When she finally approached their table, he wasn't surprised. "Excuse me," she said, her tone clipped but polite. "Could you clear this table? We're a group of 6, and there aren't any others big enough for us." Jeremiah blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I beg your pardon?" The woman gestured to the table, as if the meaning of her request should have been obvious. "This is the only large table. Could you move to one of the smaller ones? We'll need the space." Before Jeremiah could respond, Marcus stood, his face a mix of indignation and disbelief. "Do you know who this is?" The woman frowned, clearly puzzled by the question. "Should I?" Jeremiah raised a hand, signaling Marcus to sit. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered. "It's all right," he said, addressing Marcus before turning back to the woman. "I understand your need for space, ma'am, but I'm afraid I'm not moving." Her expression soured, her confidence faltering as confusion crept in. "I just thought—" "You thought wrong," Marcus interjected, unable to contain himself. Jeremiah's lips twitched in a faint smile, though his eyes held firm. "Ma'am, I assure you, this table is being used for something important. I wish you and your colleagues a pleasant morning." The woman's cheeks flushed as realization dawned. She gave a stiff nod before retreating to her group, who had been watching the exchange with mild curiosity. Marcus shook his head, still bristling. "How do you stay so composed, Judge Cole?" "That was infuriating," Jeremiah sighed. "Because anger doesn't solve anything, Marcus. It's important to choose your battles wisely." He paused, glancing toward the group now crowded around a smaller table. "But it's also important to make people confront their assumptions. Sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is silence." The words lingered in the air as Marcus absorbed their meaning. Outside, the city buzzed with life, a reminder of the complex world they were trying to change. One conversation, one case, one moment at a time. Jeremiah finished his coffee and stood, offering Marcus a firm handshake. "I'll see you at the meeting." As he walked out of the cafe, the woman from the group watched him go, her face still flushed with embarrassment. She didn't know it yet, but she'd remember that morning for a long time. Jeremiah Cole stepped into the brisk autumn air, the faint chill brushing against his face as he adjusted the collar of his coat. The cafe door closed behind him, muffling the hum of conversation within. He glanced at his watch. There was still time to walk to the Civic Center for the meeting, and he preferred to move on foot when possible. It gave him space to clear his mind and prepare for the weighty discussions ahead. As he strolled down the busy street, his thoughts drifted to the brief exchange in the cafe. Incidents like that were nothing new. They were the price he paid for walking through the world as a black man, no matter his accomplishments. Yet, despite years of navigating these interactions, they never stopped leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Jeremiah turned a corner and entered the bustling plaza that led to the Civic Center. Vendors lined the sidewalks, their colorful displays of handmade crafts and fresh produce creating a lively contrast to the cold gray of the surrounding office buildings. A street musician strummed a jazzy tune on his guitar, drawing a small crowd. The Civic Center loomed ahead, a sleek modern structure of glass and steel that mirrored the city's ambition to present itself as forward-thinking. Jeremiah approached the entrance, his leather briefcase swinging gently at his side. As he neared the glass doors, he noticed two security guards stationed outside, their blue uniforms crisp and their postures rigid. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, caught sight of Jeremiah and immediately straightened. "Excuse me, sir," the guard called out, stepping forward. "Can I help you?" Jeremiah slowed his pace, offering a polite smile. "I'm here for a meeting with the Justice Initiative panel." The guard's gaze flicked to Jeremiah's briefcase, then to his face, and his expression tightened. "I'll need to see some ID." Jeremiah nodded and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his wallet. He retrieved his identification card and handed it to the guard, who scrutinized it for longer than seemed necessary. The other guard, a shorter man with a wiry build, leaned over to glance at the ID as well. "Judge Cole?" the first guard asked, his tone skeptical. "That's correct," Jeremiah replied evenly. The guard hesitated, then handed back the ID. "We weren't told you'd be arriving." Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware my arrival required prior notice." The second guard frowned. "It's just protocol, sir. You understand how things are these days." Jeremiah didn't respond immediately. He understood all too well how things were. He'd experienced this song and dance enough to recognize its rhythm, the unnecessary scrutiny, the thinly veiled suspicion. He kept his expression neutral, knowing that pushing back would only escalate the situation. "I appreciate your diligence," Jeremiah said calmly, slipping his ID back into his pocket. "But I assure you, I have a scheduled meeting inside." The first guard shifted uncomfortably, but stepped aside. "Go on in, sir." Jeremiah inclined his head in thanks and walked past them, his back straight and his stride measured inside. The grand atrium of the Civic Center stretched before him, its high ceilings and sleek design an ode to modernity. The receptionist at the information desk greeted him warmly, and he confirmed the meeting room's location before heading up to the second floor. As he walked down the corridor, Jeremiah couldn't shake the lingering frustration from his encounter with the guards. He had handled it professionally, as always, but the sting remained. It wasn't about the ID check itself. It was the implication that someone like him couldn't possibly be the Judge Jeremiah Cole. He arrived at the conference room and pushed the door open. Inside, a dozen people sat around a large oval table, their conversations punctuated by the occasional clink of coffee cups. The room quieted as Jeremiah entered, and several heads turned in his direction. "Judge Cole!" A silver-haired man in a navy suit rose from his seat and extended a hand. "We're honored to have you with us." "Thank you, Mayor Briggs," Jeremiah said, shaking his hand firmly. "It's a pleasure to be here." As he took his seat at the table, Jeremiah noticed a few skeptical glances exchanged among the attendees. He recognized the look. It was the same look he'd seen countless times in courtrooms and boardrooms. It said, "Who is this man? Really, can he possibly be as capable as they say?" Jeremiah ignored the glances and focused on the discussion at hand. The panel dove into the agenda, addressing topics ranging from bail reform to community policing. Jeremiah listened intently, offering measured insights that drew nods of agreement from many in the room. But not everyone was receptive. Councilman Richard Larkin, a stout man with a ruddy complexion and a booming voice, leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "With all due respect, Judge Cole," he said, "these reforms you're advocating for sound idealistic reducing bail requirements for nonviolent offenders might sound good in theory, but what about the message it sends to law enforcement? What about the risk it poses to public safety?" Jeremiah met Larkin's gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "Councilman, the data shows that cash bail disproportionately affects low-income individuals, many of whom pose no flight risk or danger to the community. Our goal should be justice, not punishment for poverty." Larkin's lips tightened, and he glanced around the room as if seeking support. "I just think we need to be cautious. We don't want to compromise security in the name of fairness." Jeremiah's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone steady. Fairness and security are not mutually exclusive. In fact, a fair system strengthens public trust, which is essential for true security. The tension in the room was palpable, and Jeremiah could feel the weight of the unspoken biases that colored Larkin's objections. It wasn't just about policy. It was about the person delivering the message. Jeremiah had seen it before. The reluctance to accept a black man as an authority figure, especially in matters as contentious as criminal justice reform. The meeting continued, but the undercurrents of resistance persisted. By the time it adjourned, Jeremiah felt both drained and invigorated. The fight for change was exhausting, but it was also necessary. As he gathered his belongings, Mayor Briggs approached him. "Judge Cole, I appreciate your contributions today," the mayor said, his tone sincere. "Your perspective is invaluable." "Thank you, Mayor," Jeremiah replied. "I'm glad to be part of the conversation." As Jeremiah exited the building, he noticed a familiar figure lingering near the steps. It was the first security guard from earlier, his posture stiff and his face unreadable. When Jeremiah approached, the guard cleared his throat. "Sir," the guard said, his voice lower than before, "I just wanted to apologize for earlier. I didn't realize who you were." Jeremiah studied the man for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about who I am," he said finally. "It's about how we treat people, regardless of who they are." The guard nodded, his face flushing with shame. "You're right, I'll do better." Jeremiah inclined his head, then continued down the steps. As he walked away, he felt the familiar weight of the day's events settling on his shoulders. The fight for justice was never easy, but he carried it with quiet determination. And though the road ahead was long, Jeremiah knew he couldn't afford to stop. Jeremiah Cole walked briskly through the parking lot adjacent to the Civic Center, his mind still turning over the events of the meeting. He had hoped the discussion would yield more consensus, but Councilman Larkin's resistance had been emblematic of the entrenched attitudes that he faced time and time again. Jeremiah sighed, adjusting his coat against the chill as he approached his car, a simple black sedan, unassuming and practical. As he reached for the door handle, he heard a sharp voice behind him. "Hey, you there!" Jeremiah turned to see two uniformed police officers approaching, their postures rigid and their hands hovering near their belts. The taller of the two, whose name tag read Daniels, took the lead, his expression stern. "Yes, officers?" Jeremiah said, keeping his tone measured. Daniels glanced at the car, then back at Jeremiah. "We received a report about a suspicious individual loitering near the Civic Center. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Jeremiah blinked, momentarily stunned. "Suspicious?" he repeated. "I just came from a meeting inside. I'm Judge Jeremiah Cole." Daniel's eyes narrowed, his skepticism apparent. "You got some ID to prove that?" Jeremiah's patience, already frayed from the day's earlier encounters, was put to the test. Still, he reached into his pocket, retrieved his ID, and handed it over. Daniels examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, while his partner, a younger officer with a nervous energy, stood silently by. "This real?" Daniels asked, flipping the ID over as though expecting to find a trick. Jeremiah straightened his posture. "If you doubt its authenticity, you can confirm it with the Civic Center staff or Mayor Briggs, whom I just met with." Daniels gave a dry chuckle. "You're awfully sure of yourself. People can fake anything these days." Jeremiah inhaled slowly, reining in his growing frustration. "Officer, I've cooperated fully. Is there a reason for this line of questioning?" Daniel's smirk faded, replaced by a hard edge. "Like I said, we got a report, and you fit the description." "What description?" Jeremiah asked, his voice calm but firm. Daniels hesitated, then shifted his weight. "Black male, late 40s to 50s, acting suspicious near vehicles. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like you." Jeremiah felt the words like a punch to the gut. The vague, racially coded description, one that could apply to countless innocent men, was a stark reminder of the systemic biases he had spent his life challenging. "I'm not loitering or acting suspiciously," Jeremiah said, his voice steely. "I'm leaving a meeting. If you contact the Civic Center, this misunderstanding will be resolved." Daniels ignored the suggestion, nodding to his partner. "Check the plates." The younger officer hesitated, but then approached Jeremiah's car, pulling out a notepad and radio. Jeremiah watched him go, his chest tightening. He was no stranger to such encounters, but the indignity of it never lessened. He glanced around, noting the small crowd beginning to form at the edge of the parking lot. Phones were raised, recording the scene. "Is this really necessary?" Jeremiah asked, directing the question to Daniels. Daniels crossed his arms. "Necessary? It's procedure." Jeremiah's jaw clenched. "It's harassment." The officer's eyes flashed, and he took a step closer. "Watch your tone." At that moment, another voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Jeremiah turned to see Marcus jogging toward them, his face flushed with concern. He had clearly just exited the Civic Center and had witnessed the commotion from a distance. "Sir, are you all right?" Marcus asked, stopping beside Jeremiah. Daniels looked between the two men, his suspicion deepening. "And who are you?" "A colleague of Judge Cole," Marcus said sharply. "What's the issue here?" Daniels sneered. "Colleague, sure. Let's not complicate things, kid." Marcus bristled, but Jeremiah placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Marcus, it's fine." "No, it's not fine," Marcus snapped. "This is ridiculous." Jeremiah turned back to Daniels, his voice low but firm. "Officer, you're making a mistake. I'd suggest you confirm my identity with someone inside before this escalates further." Before Daniels could respond, the younger officer returned, his face pale. "The plates check out cars registered to Jeremiah Cole." Daniels frowned, but didn't back down. "Doesn't mean much. Plenty of people use stolen identities." "Stolen identities?" Marcus exclaimed. "You've got to be kidding me." The tension hung heavy in the air. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their phones capturing every moment. Jeremiah felt the weight of their eyes, the gravity of the situation pressing on him like a vice. Finally, Daniel seemed to relent, though his tone remained curt. "Fine, you're free to go, But next time, make sure you're not giving people a reason to call us." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed, his composure slipping for just a moment. "I'll remember that, officer." With that, Daniels and his partner retreated, their presence leaving a bitter aftertaste. The crowd began to disperse, though a few lingered, their gazes filled with curiosity and quiet solidarity. "Sir, are you okay?" Marcus asked again, his voice softer now. Jeremiah nodded, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "I'm fine, Marcus. Thank you." But he wasn't fine, not really. He felt the familiar burn of humiliation, the sting of being reduced to a suspicious individual, despite everything he had achieved. He thought of the guards earlier, of Larkin's thinly veiled condescension in the meeting room, and now this. The pattern was as clear as it was exhausting. As they walked back to the car, Marcus spoke again. "You shouldn't have to deal with this. Not after everything you've done." Jeremiah placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Marcus, this isn't just about me. It's about the world we're trying to change, and moments like this are why we can't stop." Marcus nodded, his expression resolute. "What can I do?" Jeremiah smiled faintly. "Keep doing what you're doing. Speak out. Don't let these moments pass unnoticed." As Jeremiah drove away, he couldn't shake the lingering unease. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, insidious system that thrived on implicit biases and unspoken rules. He had spent his career dismantling that system piece by piece, but days like this reminded him how much work was left to do. Back at his office, Jeremiah sat at his desk, staring at the stack of case files before him. The anger simmering beneath his calm exterior refused to subside. He had been pushed too far today, and he knew that staying silent wasn't an option. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Mitchell here." "Mitchell, it's Jeremiah," he said, his tone measured. "We need to talk about Daniels." The phone call with Mitchell was brief, but pointed. Jeremiah had no time to waste. As the evening settled in and the city lights flickered outside his office window, a sharp sense of resolve had begun to crystallize in his chest. He'd faced indignities like this before, but today had been different. Today, something inside him had shifted. A line he hadn't even realized existed had been crossed. Mitchell's voice had been a steady anchor, even though the weight of the situation was heavy in both their words. "We'll meet tomorrow," Mitchell had said. "We need to handle this carefully, but it's time to take action." Jeremiah ended the call, setting the phone down slowly. The injustice had to be addressed, but it was bigger than Officer Daniels. It was about the systemic biases that defined everything from the moment Jeremiah stepped into the parking lot, to the questions he was asked, to the way people automatically doubted his identity. Every part of it, every single glance, every assumption made, was a chain that he refused to let bind him any longer. By the time he reached Mitchell's office, the tension in his mind had been building like a slow-burning fuse. He could feel the heat rising within him. As he entered Mitchell's law office, the familiar scent of leather-bound books and polished wood greeted him. Mitchell, a seasoned lawyer with his own battles against the system, rose from behind his desk, his face lined with concern. "Jeremiah," Mitchell began, "are you sure about this? I know how frustrating this situation is, but it's going to get ugly. We can't just walk in there and make waves without a strategy." Jeremiah took a seat, running his fingers over the edge of the desk as he considered his friend's words. "Mitchell, I've been patient for too long. I've played the game by their rules, over and over again. But today it's different. I'm not going to let this go." Mitchell's expression softened, his gaze heavy with the weight of understanding. "You know I've got your back, but you have to be prepared for them to hit back twice as hard. They've already tried to silence you before. Larkin, Daniels, all of them. This is a system that isn't just going to roll over." Jeremiah's jaw clenched. "I'm not asking for them to roll over. I'm asking for accountability, for the system to see what it's doing, to realize that people like me, like you, we're not just going to keep taking this quietly." Mitchell nodded slowly, picking up a legal pad from his desk and scribbling a few notes. "All right, we need to make sure the media knows what's happening. If we don't make this public, they'll bury it. But we need solid evidence. something irrefutable. If we go public with just your word, they'll spin it as another angry black man with a chip on his shoulder." Jeremiah let out a breath. "I've got something better than just my word." As they discussed their next steps, the evening stretched into hours. The strategy was becoming clearer. Pull in the press, contact allies in the city council, and make sure that Daniels and the department could not hide behind their badges any longer. But even as the plan solidified, there was a sense of unease that hovered over both men. It wasn't just about one incident anymore, it was about the injustice that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The next morning, a news story broke. It wasn't what Jeremiah had expected. A headline flashed across his phone: "Federal judge accused of escalating confrontation with officers after suspicious behavior report." Jeremiah stared at the screen, his stomach dropping. The article, written by a local news outlet with ties to the police department, spun the entire encounter in a completely different light. It portrayed Jeremiah as an aggressive, belligerent figure, acting suspiciously, according to Officer Daniels' report, and completely omitted the part where Daniels had falsely accused him of loitering. The narrative was one of defiance, of an entitled judge refusing to cooperate with law enforcement. It was clear what they were doing. They were attempting to tarnish his credibility before he had a chance to make his case. Jeremiah's first instinct was anger, a deep, seething anger at the lie that was now circulating. But that wasn't going to solve anything. He had to fight back. With the media already framing the situation against him, every move now had to be calculated. Minutes later, Mitchell called. "Did you see the article?" "I saw it," Jeremiah replied, his voice tight. "They've already started their campaign. They're trying to make me look like the villain." Mitchell's tone was steely. "We need to counteract that. We can't let them control the narrative. We need to get ahead of this. Show that we have proof. We'll need the security footage from the parking lot." Jeremiah was already on it. He hung up and made the call to the Civic Center. It took some convincing, but he was able to secure the footage from the security cameras. As soon as the video appeared on his phone, his stomach turned. The footage was clear. It showed Daniels approaching him and the young officer, the conversation unfolding just as it had in real life. There was no ambiguity, no accusations of loitering, no false threats. He knew what had to be done. He called Mitchell back. "I've got the footage, I'm going to release it." "Are you sure about this?" Mitchell asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Once you release it, you're exposing yourself to more scrutiny. You might not get the chance to control the message after that." Jeremiah's resolve hardened. "I don't care anymore. They need to see what happened. They need to see how I was treated. This isn't just about me, it's about everyone who's ever been treated like this." Mitchell paused, then sighed. "All right, I'm with you. Let's do it. I'll handle the media contacts. You handle your part." Jeremiah took a deep breath and hit send, releasing the footage to the press, making sure it was tagged with a clear statement from his office. "This is the truth. What happened in the parking lot is unacceptable, and it's time for systemic accountability." Within minutes, his phone began buzzing relentlessly, the media starting to pick up the story. The narrative was shifting, but it wasn't the only thing Jeremiah had to worry about. Word was already spreading through the police department. Officer Daniels was on the defensive, trying to justify his actions. The tension between them was reaching its breaking point. Jeremiah knew the backlash would come hard and fast, but he couldn't back down now. Hours later, as he sat in his office, waiting for the inevitable fallout, a knock at the door broke the silence. "Come in," he called. The door opened slowly, and a tall figure stepped inside. It was Mitchell, but there was something different about his posture today. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw tight. "They're not happy," Mitchell said, closing the door behind him. Jeremiah stood, meeting his friend's eyes. "I know. They've already called a meeting. Daniels is requesting disciplinary action against you, saying you provoked him. The department's already circling the wagons." Jeremiah's pulse quickened. "And what about the footage?" Mitchell shook his head. "They're trying to discredit it, say it's been tampered with, but the media's running with it, and the pressure's starting to mount. This could go all the way to the mayor's office." Jeremiah let out a slow breath, running his hand through his hair. "They can't just keep silencing people like this. Not anymore, I'm not going down without a fight." The tension in the room was suffocating, both men knowing that this was the moment when everything could change, when the system could either bury the truth or face it head-on. Jeremiah straightened, his voice firm. "It's time to make the next move. They won't silence me, not this time." The tension in the room was palpable as Jeremiah Cole walked into the mayor's office. The morning's media blitz had done its work. The footage of his confrontation with Officer Daniels had gone viral, garnering both support and backlash. But Jeremiah wasn't here for the public spectacle. He was here for something far more important: justice. Mitchell had arranged the meeting, knowing the storm was about to hit. Jeremiah had a quiet resolve about him as he entered the sleek, glass-paneled room where the mayor and a handful of top city officials were already seated. Among them was a familiar face: Officer Daniels, sitting with his arms folded across his chest, looking as smug as ever. "Judge Cole," the mayor said, his voice neutral. "Thank you for coming. We've gathered here to discuss the situation with the police department, but I think you're aware of what's at stake here." Jeremiah didn't sit immediately. He stood tall, his gaze meeting Daniels with a cold intensity. "I'm fully aware of what's at stake, Mayor. But what I don't understand is why the city continues to tolerate this kind of behavior from its law enforcement officer. Daniels assaulted my character, and now he's trying to spin this into a justification for his actions." Daniels' expression shifted into one of barely contained contempt. "You've got it all wrong, Judge. I was just doing my job. You, on the other hand, are clearly playing the victim." Jeremiah's fist clenched at his side, but he kept his composure. "Playing the victim, officer? It wasn't enough for you to challenge my identity. You've now tried to smear me publicly, all because I didn't fit your idea of who I should be." The mayor cleared his throat, attempting to mediate. "Gentlemen, let's keep this civil. We're here to work through this, not escalate tensions." But Jeremiah wasn't backing down. He took a step toward Daniels, his voice unwavering. "It's not just about me. It's about every person who's been subjected to this kind of treatment, people like me, who work hard every day to prove our worth, only to be told that we don't belong. You don't get to hide behind the badge, officer." Daniels scoffed. "And you don't get to play the hero, either. You're just another angry man looking for a reason to blame others for your own failures." The room fell silent. The mayor looked at Daniels sharply, and a murmur of disapproval rippled through the officials present. But Daniels didn't back down. He leaned forward, his voice laced with malice. "Let's not pretend that the police are the only ones who've been the target of false accusations. You think you're above it all, but you're just as flawed as anyone else, and maybe, just maybe, you've got your own biases you need to confront." Jeremiah's breath caught. He was accustomed to the subtle jabs, the quiet insinuations, but Daniels's words were a direct hit. The officer was trying to deflect the blame, twist the narrative, and demonize Jeremiah for exposing the truth. Jeremiah could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, but he knew this was his chance to turn the tide. He wasn't going to let this man get away with it. He stepped forward, his voice firm, but controlled. "Your problem, Officer Daniels, is not that I'm flawed. It's that I'm not the person you expect me to be. You see a black man in power, and it doesn't sit right with you. So you use your authority to undermine me, to drag me down to your level. But I won't play your game." Daniel's face reddened. "You don't know anything about me." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. "Oh, I know enough. I know that you've been involved in incidents before. Allegations of excessive force, racism, misconduct. I know that the department has buried those stories because people like you are protected, untouchable, but that's over now, Daniels." At that, the mayor looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. He glanced at Daniels before focusing back on Jeremiah. "Now, let's not make assumptions, Judge. We've already had one investigation into the matter, and it's ongoing. We don't want to jump to conclusions without all the facts." Jeremiah's lips curled into a bitter smile. "The facts are right here, Mayor. The footage, the witness statements, the pattern of behavior. The only thing ongoing here is a cover-up, and you know it." The mayor opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Daniels stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is absurd," he spat, his voice rising. "You're going to believe this man over me. I've served this city for years, I've put my life on the line every day. And now, you're going to let one video and a few statements tear me down?" Jeremiah's heart was pounding in his chest, but he remained unshaken. "Your actions have consequences, Officer Daniels. Just because you've worn that badge for years doesn't mean you get to disregard the law or the people you swore to protect." Daniels' face contorted with rage, his nostrils flaring. "You're a joke," he muttered, turning toward the mayor. "And you're going to let this farce continue? Fine. Let's see how it plays out. But you can bet your ass I'll make sure it's the last time someone like him tries to undermine me." Jeremiah's blood ran cold. The implication was clear. Daniels was a man with power, and he wasn't going to take this lying down. The stakes had never been higher, and the stakes would only continue to climb from here. But before Daniels could say anything more, the mayor stood up, signaling for the room to settle. "Enough, both of you," the mayor said, his voice tight. "This is getting out of hand. We're not here to engage in a shouting match." Jeremiah took a deep breath, the adrenaline surging through his veins. His resolve had only grown stronger in that moment. The mayor could try to calm things down, but this wasn't going to go away. Not now, not ever. "I'm done playing by your rules," Jeremiah said quietly, his eyes fixed on Daniels. "You've made your stance clear, so have I." As he turned to leave the room, Mitchell caught his eye, giving him a subtle nod. They had reached a turning point, one that would shape the future of the city. But for now, the battle was far from over. The next few days were a blur. The media frenzy around the confrontation reached new heights, with reporters picking up on every detail and amplifying the voices of those who had supported or condemned Jeremiah. Behind the scenes, the pressure from the police department and the mayor's office was mounting. Jeremiah had expected the resistance, but the level of retaliation was more than he'd anticipated. Mitchell had been in constant contact, trying to keep the legal wheels turning while navigating the political minefield that Daniels and his supporters had thrown at them. The pushback had been relentless, and Daniels wasn't backing down. But neither was Jeremiah. He met with more officials, even reached out to activists who had supported his cause, each conversation pushing him further into the realization that this fight wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger than one man's dignity. It was about the integrity of the system, about proving that people like Daniels couldn't be allowed to operate with impunity. By the end of the week, Jeremiah knew that he would have to make his final move. But what that would be, how he would outmaneuver Daniels and his supporters, remained uncertain. Daniels had made it personal, and now it was time for Jeremiah to make a choice. He could go further, continue to press his case through the media, through the courts, or he could take a more direct approach. The question lingered in the air, unresolved, like a storm cloud hanging overhead. Jeremiah Cole stood in the hallway outside the mayor's office, his pulse quickening. The tension from the past few days had reached its zenith, and now it was time for the showdown. Word had spread that Officer Daniels had been called in for a meeting, but Jeremiah wasn't just waiting for another round of disingenuous pleasantries. This time, there would be no pretending. This was the moment when everything would either break or change. Inside the mayor's office, Daniels was no doubt holding court, spinning his version of events to anyone who would listen. But Jeremiah knew the truth. He had the evidence, the footage, the witness testimonies. He wasn't just going to stand by while Daniels and the corrupt systems he represented continued to twist the narrative. As the door to the office swung open, Mitchell walked out, his face grim. "It's time," he said quietly, gesturing for Jeremiah to enter. Jeremiah took a deep breath and nodded. He stepped into the room, his eyes immediately locking onto Daniels, who was seated across from the mayor, his arms crossed and his face twisted in irritation. The mayor, seated at the head of the table, looked up with a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Judge Cole," the mayor said, his voice cold but polite. "I'm glad you could join us. We were just discussing the ongoing investigation." Jeremiah didn't sit. He stood tall, his presence commanding attention. "I'm sure Officer Daniels has told you his side of things, but let me make one thing clear. This investigation is not about a misunderstanding. It's about systemic corruption, about the way officers like Daniels operate with impunity." Daniels smirked, clearly unbothered. "Oh, really? I'm the one operating with impunity, Judge Cole. You've made some pretty serious accusations. You've got some nerve to stand there and pretend you're the victim in all of this." Jeremiah's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not the victim," But you sure are, Daniels. You're the victim of a system that's allowed you to continue this charade for years, unchecked. You've been able to act with arrogance, with a sense of entitlement, as if the law doesn't apply to you. Daniels stood suddenly, his chair scraping violently across the floor. You want to accuse me of corruption, of racism, of misconduct? His voice was rising now, the anger evident in his posture. You don't know a damn thing about me, Cole. I've served this city faithfully, I've put my life on the line, and now you think you can come in here and tell me I'm the problem? Jeremiah met his glare with equal intensity, refusing to back down. I've seen the reports, Daniels. The excessive force allegations, the complaints that have been buried. Don't think for 1 second that I'm just going to stand by and let you twist this. Daniels's face flushed with rage. You think you're better than me? You think just because you're a judge, you're untouchable? I've been serving this city long before you even started playing the system, and you... He jabbed a finger at Jeremiah, his voice thick with contempt. You come in here, acting like you're above it all, but I see right through you. You think I'm some racist cop just because I don't bow down to your type. You don't deserve the respect I've given you. You don't deserve any of it. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but it was clear that Daniels wasn't backing down. For the first time, Jeremiah felt the full brunt of the officer's prejudices laid bare. This wasn't just about one bad encounter, it was about an entire system of corruption, of racism, of unchecked power. Daniels wasn't just defending himself, he was defending an entire system that had empowered him to act with such disdain. Jeremiah's hands clenched into fists, but he took a step forward, his voice steady. You're wrong, Daniels. I don't think I'm above the law. I think you're above it. You think you can throw your weight around and intimidate people because that's what your system has taught you, but I'm not going to let you get away with it anymore. The mayor cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. Gentlemen, please, let's not escalate things further. We're here to discuss the facts, not get into a shouting match. But Jeremiah was past reasoning. His eyes remained fixed on Daniels, his voice unwavering. The facts are in front of us. The footage is clear. I've been targeted for no reason other than the color of my skin. You've been allowed to get away with it for too long. You've used your badge to justify your bigotry, and now it ends. Daniels laughed bitterly, but the laugh held no humor. You think this will just end, huh? You think your little campaign is going to take me down? Do you have any idea who I am? I'm connected, I've got people in high places, and you? He pointed directly at Jeremiah, his voice venomous. You're just another black man with a chip on his shoulder. You'll never win. The system will always protect me. Jeremiah's heart was pounding now, the anger building inside him, but he refused to let it overtake him. He had trained himself for moments like this. Moments when the stakes were highest, when everything hung in the balance. He had seen enough injustice to know that it was not enough to simply speak out. He had to act. I've had enough of your excuses, Jeremiah said, his voice like steel. You don't get to hide behind the system anymore, Daniels. The truth is out, and the world is watching. You might think you're untouchable, but the law applies to you too. Daniel's eyes flicked nervously to the mayor, who was now sitting back, arms folded, watching the confrontation unfold. The room was tense, the silence between the two men deafening. Jeremiah stood tall, unwavering, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. Daniel's bravado faltered under the weight of Jeremiah's words, and the officer's expression shifted from anger to something else. Something darker. You want to play that game, Judge? Daniel sneered. Fine, let's see how long your so-called truth holds up when the department pulls everything it can to bury this. You think you're the first to challenge me? I've seen it all before. Jeremiah didn't flinch. This time is different, Daniels, because I won't back down. The mayor finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Enough, both of you. We'll take this to a formal review, but I'll be clear, this situation cannot continue. There will be an investigation, but I can't promise anything. Jeremiah took a step back, his eyes still fixed on Daniels. He knew the game was far from over, but this moment, this confrontation, had been a necessary step. It wasn't just about the investigation anymore, it was about showing the world that this kind of injustice couldn't go unchecked. "I'll be watching," Jeremiah said quietly, his voice a warning. "And I'll be making sure this doesn't just disappear into the shadows like it always does." The mayor nodded, the tension still hanging thick in the air as Daniels stood in place. Fuming but speechless for the first time, Jeremiah turned toward the door, Mitchell following closely behind. As they stepped out of the office, Mitchell spoke first, his voice low. "You did it. You held your ground." Jeremiah exhaled deeply. "It's not over, Mitchell. It's just beginning." But the uncertainty of the outcome still lingered. The investigation was just the first hurdle. Daniels had powerful allies, and Jeremiah knew the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles. Yet, despite the lingering tension, one thing was clear. Jeremiah had taken a stand, and it would not be easy for anyone to silence him again. The dust had barely settled in the aftermath of the heated confrontation. Jeremiah Cole stood on the steps of the Civic Center, the chill of the early evening air biting at his skin. The media frenzy had escalated since the footage of his encounter with Officer Daniels had been released, and while public opinion was sharply divided, the tides were beginning to shift in his favor. It wasn't easy, it wasn't fast, but the cracks in the foundation of the system were starting to show. In the days following the confrontation, the mayor's office had quietly initiated a formal investigation into Officer Daniels' conduct. Daniels, who had once strutted around the department like a king, was now fighting for his career. He'd been put on paid leave, while Internal Affairs dug deeper into the complaints against him, including the mounting public pressure to hold him accountable. Jeremiah wasn't satisfied with just a suspension. He knew this was the beginning, not the end. Still, the actions had set the stage for a bigger conversation, one that could no longer be ignored. The pressure mounted on the city's leadership, forcing them to acknowledge the systemic racism and corruption festering within their police department. A few days after the investigation was announced, Jeremiah was summoned to a press conference. It was a show of strength from the mayor's office, an attempt to project confidence, to show that the system was working as it should. But Jeremiah wasn't there to play the game. He had a message to deliver. The reporters gathered in the conference room, a buzz of activity in the air. Jeremiah stood at the podium, flanked by the mayor and a handful of city officials. The cameras were rolling, and for a moment, everything felt surreal. The room, filled with flashes and murmurs, was a reminder of how far he had come. From the quiet streets of his childhood to this moment, standing at the center of a storm. The mayor cleared his throat, offering a carefully worded statement. "We are committed to transparency, fairness, and accountability. The investigation into Officer Daniels is ongoing, and we are committed to ensuring that the people of this city receive the justice they deserve." Jeremiah stepped forward, the quiet authority of his presence cutting through the mayor's rehearsed speech. "I appreciate the mayor's words, but I need to make one thing clear. This is not just about one officer. This is about a system that has been allowed to operate unchecked for far too long. This is about the countless people who have been silenced, whose voices have been ignored, because the system is rigged against them." He paused, looking around at the sea of reporters, at the city officials seated at the table. His eyes locked with those of the camera operators, the journalists, the audience listening at home. "I will not stand by while this system continues to destroy lives," he continued, his voice unwavering. "The time for change is now. This investigation, this fight, it is just the beginning. We must not stop here. We must continue to push, continue to demand justice. For all those who cannot speak for themselves, I will not back down, and neither should any of you." There was a long silence in the room before a few journalists began to clamor with questions, but it was clear that Jeremiah's words had struck a chord. He wasn't just a judge anymore, he was a symbol of something much bigger, a force for change that could not be ignored. As the conference ended, Jeremiah stepped away from the podium, his heart racing. The media would now turn its focus on the investigation, and he knew the stakes had never been higher. But there was a sense of satisfaction in the air, a feeling of having done what was right. The first step had been taken. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Officer Daniels intensified. Internal Affairs unearthed a troubling pattern of misconduct, including excessive force incidents, racial profiling, and attempts to intimidate witnesses. Daniels' past actions were now in the spotlight, And the momentum continued to build. Public pressure mounted, and for the first time in his career, Daniels found himself cornered. His badge no longer a shield, but a liability. Jeremiah had known that taking a stand would have consequences. The media was quick to sensationalize the conflict, with some outlets questioning his motivations and others questioning the police department's ability to reform. But with each new headline, each new protest, the truth became harder to ignore. The mayor's office was forced to address the issues more openly. Reforms were announced. A new task force would be created to investigate police misconduct and implement better oversight. While it wasn't the sweeping reform Jeremiah had hoped for, it was a step in the right direction. It was evidence that his actions had made an impact. Jeremiah's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Mitchell. Got word today that Daniels was officially fired. They're calling it a breach of public trust. This is a win, but we both know this fight isn't over. Jeremiah smiled, but the victory felt bittersweet. Daniels had been held accountable, but the system that had allowed him to thrive remained. The battle was far from over, but this moment marked a shift, a small victory in a much larger war. Months passed, and the fight continued. Jeremiah found himself speaking at more rallies, at town halls, and in meetings with community leaders. His voice had become a clarion call for justice, a beacon of hope for those who had been forgotten by the system. But with that voice came new challenges. The attacks from his critics grew louder. Some called him a troublemaker, a man looking for problems where there were none. Others questioned his intentions, trying to undermine his credibility by labeling him as a political figure. But Jeremiah had long since learned to tune out the noise. He focused on the work, on the cause, and on the people whose lives were affected by the very system he was fighting to change. He met with activists, with families who had lost loved ones to police violence, with lawyers who were committed to criminal justice reform. The network of support grew, and Jeremiah realized that his fight had become a movement that was no longer just about one person's story, but about an entire community's struggle for fairness and equity. And yet, even with the progress that had been made, Jeremiah knew that change was slow, that the road ahead would be long. There were still setbacks, still moments when the weight of the fight felt unbearable. But in those moments, he leaned on the strength he had gained through his struggles. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, reflecting on how far he had come, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see a young woman standing in the doorway, her face familiar, yet different. She was a reporter from the local news station who had been covering his journey from the very beginning. "Judge Cole," she said, her voice soft but respectful. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done. For people like me, who didn't have a voice before, you've made a difference. We all see the change you've brought, and we're grateful." Jeremiah smiled, the exhaustion of the past few months heavy in his bones, but the warmth of the woman's words gave him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a while. "Thank you," he said, standing up. "It's not about me, it's about all of us, and we've still got a long way to go." She nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "And we're with you." As Jeremiah stood there, looking out over the city he had fought for, he realized that his journey wasn't just about exposing the wrongs of the system. It was about something deeper, about helping others find their voice, about creating a world where justice wasn't just a concept, but a reality. The work was far from over, but he knew that with every step forward, they were getting closer. Jeremiah Cole had taken a stand, and though the battle was ongoing, there was no turning back. The system had been shaken, and though it wasn't perfect, it was beginning to change. And with that, a new hope had been kindled. Jeremiah Cole stood at the window of his office, staring out over the city. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden light over the skyline. He had seen this view countless times, but today it felt different, more meaningful, more significant. He had always known that the work he did mattered, that his voice could make a difference in the courtroom. But the past few months had shown him something even more profound. The power of standing up, of fighting not just for justice in individual cases, but for a system that needed to change, for a society that needed healing. The journey that had led him here had been long and difficult. From the moment Officer Daniels had tried to undermine his authority and strip away his dignity. To the relentless battle in the press, the courtroom, and the streets, Jeremiah had been tested in ways he hadn't imagined. He had faced not only the direct injustice of being targeted because of his race, but also the more insidious forces of systemic racism and corruption that permeated the institutions he had spent his life serving. But in those moments of trial, he had learned something crucial. Not just about the system, but about himself. Jeremiah had learned that standing up for what is right often means standing alone, but it also means finding allies in unexpected places. Through the struggle, he had discovered a deeper understanding of his own resilience and the importance of holding on to his principles. His victory over Officer Daniels had been more than just the end of one man's career. It was a powerful reminder of the capacity for change, the potential for justice to rise, even when it feels like the system is stacked against you. His resolve had been tested at every turn. But through it all, Jeremiah had never lost sight of the ultimate goal: to expose the flaws in a system that had too long allowed people like Daniels to operate unchecked. He had witnessed the ugly side of power, the arrogance, the entitlement, the willingness to ignore basic human dignity. And in doing so, he had discovered just how much it meant to challenge that power head-on. His role as a judge had always been about enforcing the law, but his work now had a broader scope. It was about ensuring that those laws were applied equally and justly, no matter who the individual was or where they came from. The days following Daniels' termination were a whirlwind of press conferences, public statements, and continued scrutiny. The public had rallied behind Jeremiah, the truth of his words resonating with people who had long felt the weight of the same system. But even in the wake of his success, there was no rest. The battle against systemic injustice was ongoing, and while one victory had been won, countless others remained to be fought. Daniels' dismissal was only a small part of the larger picture, one that demanded deep reform and accountability across the board. Jeremiah knew that the challenges were far from over. The police department would fight back, and so would other institutions that were built on the same oppressive foundations. But as he prepared for the next steps, meeting with community leaders, organizing with activists, advocating for legislative change, he knew he wasn't fighting alone. The people who had joined him on this journey, who had supported him when things got tough, would continue to stand by him. Together, they could make the difference. Broader implications: systemic injustice and collective action. Jeremiah's fight against Officer Daniels was not just a personal one. It was a direct confrontation with the systemic issues that have plagued society for centuries. The incident that sparked this journey, a false accusation, a prejudiced police officer using his badge to harass an innocent man, was not an isolated case. It was part of a much larger issue: the abuse of power, the discrimination built into law enforcement, and the societal structures that allowed such behavior to persist without consequence. But the story of Jeremiah's fight also revealed something else: the power of resistance. His actions, his decision to take a stand and refuse to back down, sparked a chain reaction. The investigation into Daniels, the exposure of his history of misconduct, and the pressure from the public led to more than just one officer being held accountable. The story went beyond one man's wrongdoings. It revealed a deeper problem, one that needed collective action to address. The fight wasn't about one person being wronged, it was about the entire system being wrong. Through his ordeal, Jeremiah had become more than just a judge. He had become a leader in the fight for justice. His actions had inspired others to speak out, to stand up, to demand better from those who had been given the power to enforce the law. His stand had made people believe that change was possible, that the system could be reformed, that the corrupt could be held accountable, and that justice could be more than just a theoretical ideal. But it wasn't just about policy changes or public statements, it was about people's lives. The fight for justice, for equality, was deeply personal. Every person who had ever been subjected to mistreatment, every family torn apart by unjust systems, every voice silenced by fear or oppression. Jeremiah's journey was for them. His story was a reminder that the struggle for justice is never easy, but it is always worth it. His resilience was a testament to the fact that, while the road is long and fraught with obstacles, progress is possible.